We're beginning chapter 13, and this is one of the most important chapters in the text for your study of macroeconomics. It is a basic model that you can use to understand the effects of economic policy and the business cycle. So, we'll begin by laying out what's called the dynamic aggregate demand curve. Then we'll talk about the solo growth curve in the next video. Then real shocks, and then we'll put together the model and talk about aggregate demand shocks and short-run aggregate supply curve. And finally, we'll have shocks to the components of aggregate demand. So, over the past 50 years, real GDP has grown at an average rate of 3.3%, but it's been highly variable, as the blue line shows. So it really looks almost like an EKG or something. Quite volatile. There's periods of relatively low volatility, and there's periods of relatively high volatility. So business fluctuations are fluctuations in the growth rate of real GDP around its trend growth. A recession is a widespread and significant decline in real income and in employment. We can see that the columns of light blue shaded are when the recessions have occurred over the last 50, 60 years, and they correspond with spikes in the unemployment rate. So the dynamic aggregate demand curve is a curve which shows all the combinations of inflation and real growth, real GDP growth, that are consistent with a specified rate of growth of spending. Spending growth is equal to the rate of growth of the money supply plus the rate of growth of the velocity of money. That comes from the quantity theory of money in dynamic form that we studied in the previous chapter. So you've got money supply growth plus velocity of money growth, that's spending growth, is equal to growth rate of P, which is inflation, plus the growth rate of real GDP. Growth rate of spending equals the inflation rate plus the growth rate of the economy. So the aggregate demand curve gives combinations of inflation and real growth, P and YR, that are consistent with a fixed level of spending growth. Let's look at it. Here we've got a fixed level of aggregate spending growth at 5%. On the graph, we've got one axis of real GDP growth, growth rate in Y, and inflation rate, the growth rate in P. These are all accommodations along this line which add to 5, which is the predetermined spending growth rate. You can have 5 inflation and 0 growth. You can have 2 inflation and 3 growth, 7% rate of inflation and minus 2% growth, or a recession. Or you can have 5% real GDP growth and 0% inflation. We're not showing possibilities of even higher inflation and further declines in real GDP. They're also possible to add to 5, and we're also not showing the combinations of real GDP and deflation, which are also possible as adding to 5. So if velocity growth rate is at 0 and money growth rate is at 5%, then inflation and real growth must equal 5%. Let's say that aggregate demand, the dynamic aggregate demand curve, shifts to the right. That will occur if spending growth accelerates. If it goes from 5% a year to 7% a year, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right, because now we have combinations of inflation and real growth that add to 7 rather than 5. So whereas before a 7% inflation rate was consistent with a real GDP decline of 2%, when spending growth increases, a 7% inflation rate is consistent with zero growth. And a 2% inflation rate, which before, when aggregate spending growth was at 5%, was consistent with 3% real GDP growth, is now consistent with 5% real GDP growth. So here's a check yourself. If your aggregate demand curve has a money growth rate of 7% and a velocity growth rate of 0%, that means aggregate spending is growing at 7%. So inflation and real growth have to add to 7%. If real growth is 0, that means inflation is 7%. If spending growth increases, it will shift dynamic aggregate demand outward to the right.